My name is Chris Munns. I lead developer advocacy for serverless at AWS. I'm joined here by James Beswick, who's on my team. James, you want to say hi again?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm James Beswick. I'm a developer advocate in the serverless DA team.
Yeah. Thank you, James. So in this session, we're going to be talking about some other topics here. We've spent basically the last hour talking about first kind of big picture. Why are we talking about Lambda, a compute service, during S3's birthday? And the history here being that originally Lambda was designed as a compute service meant to pretty much work directly alongside of Amazon S3. And it's something that we've seen many customers do. And then James went on to talk about some of the patterns and how that works and pretty cool things you could do, such as uploading directly to S3 in secure ways from different applications that you have. And he hopped into Postman and showed a bunch of API examples. Now, one thing, though, that we want to do is help you understand the best, at least best in our mind, and right ways to think about deploying, building, and managing your Lambda-based applications. And so in this session, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how you think about that build and deploy. And we'll reference some of the code that James just showed us. And then we're going to talk a little bit about observability, performance, monitoring, troubleshooting, and how you can think about how to get into all of that. So kind of two things that we'll talk about here. And again, this is a live session, so James and I are both here in the chat. You can ask some questions and we will do our best to address them as we can. Let's dive in. So the first thing we're going to be talking about here today is that build and deploy aspect. And now there are a number of different tools that you can use to do this, both that are made by AWS, as well as those that are from partners, as well as those from the open source community. Now, one tool that we have here at AWS is called SAM, or Serverless Application Model. And so SAM is a tool that we first launched almost about 3 years ago now, I think, originally. And it has two different components to it. So the two parts of SAM, and oh, by the way, sorry. So what you're seeing here, this little squirrel guy, that's Sam the squirrel. That is our unofficial / official, sometimes less official than unofficial mascot for SAM here at AWS. We've got them on T-shirts and stickers and stuff like that. And hopefully, when next time you see us at an in-person event someday, we can get you some of the stickers or socks or things like that. So the two parts that make up SAM, one side is the templates. So SAM templates are essentially an extension on top of what's possible today with AWS CloudFormation. So CloudFormation is an infrastructure as code tool. It allows you to create these templates, effectively structured text documents in either JSON or YAML that you can then go and use to provision and manage AWS resources up in the cloud, as it were. And so with SAM, we get some special capabilities, which I'll show you here in a moment, that greatly simplify the work involved in building these templates for serverless applications. The second part, which came out a little bit later, is the SAM CLI. And so this is a unique command line tool that we have for building, deploying, and managing serverless apps. You probably saw James do a little bit of that here in the console previously. But SAM is, the SAM CLI, again, is a tool specific for serverless, Lambda-based apps, but really extends across the use cases and has a number of capabilities. So again, what makes SAM so powerful? So this is an example of a SAM template, and this is a pretty generic example here. So we see that this is exactly 20 lines of code, but those 20 lines of, in this case, YAML, are super powerful. In those 20 lines, we get a Lambda function, an IAM role, an API gateway endpoint definition, and a DynamoDB table all configured. And these are kind of the most common core aspects that you would see in a serverless application. So in these 20 lines, it is going to basically configure all of those resources in the appropriate AWS services for you. And I think another way to think about it is from this visualization here is you get this stuff from that 20 lines. So again, you get this API gateway endpoint that would talk to your Lambda function and invoke it when there was an API call made. It would then, in this case, that Lambda function has access to write to a certain DynamoDB table. And all of the permissioning, all of that good stuff is taken care of for you. So you don't have to think about it too much or do a whole lot of extra work here. So that's the brief intro to it here. Let's actually go and look at some code for this.
We did have one question, Chris. Why is Sam a squirrel?
Well, why wouldn't it be a squirrel?
Good answer.
Yeah. So it's kind of a internal rumor and kind of a mysterious story why Sam became a squirrel. I've been here in the serverless org at AWS for over 4 years now, and we've just always used this squirrel mascot for various things. And so where it first came from is a mystery for the ages. So I had mentioned that I wanted to demonstrate some of the code that is a SAM template here. Now, unfortunately, right before we came back live again, James and I realized that we couldn't share the Cloud9 console that we had configured inside of our shared account. Not sure what we did wrong with the permissioning on there, but it does prove out that IAM is a very capable service at helping you protect your resources. So we'll have to be a little smoother about that transition in the future. But between the two different code repositories that we've shared as part of the previous sessions, there are example SAM templates in there that you can go and see. So earlier, James gave some examples of uploading an object to S3 and what can happen with that. And so if you go into the code repository, which hopefully we can share back in here again for those of you who are just joining, you can find what I'm looking at here. Again, this is in the AWS samples GitHub repo under S3-week-serverless examples. And if we go into these different directories, we'll see, I should go back here a little slower, we'll see a folder that has the code, and then you'll see a template.yaml file. This is that SAM template. So let me make sure that this is large enough so that folks can read the code here. And so this file is really straightforward. It's 37 lines. And what comes out of this is an S3 bucket. So this is a resource line here that we configure an S3 bucket, or number of lines, I should say. It's a resource definition. And we see that it has a type of S3 bucket. And then for properties, it just has a name of the bucket. And so this would be the equivalent of in the console, you go into the S3 console, clicking create bucket, and then giving it a name and clicking through all the defaults. And this is actually just using the base CloudFormation resource. There's no special resource that we have here for SAM. In SAM, though, what we'll see here down below this is a special resource type called AWS Serverless Function. Now, we also have in CloudFormation a AWS Lambda function definition. That's a little bit different. For the resources here, that's a AWS serverless, and then whatever the resource name might be. And we have functions and APIs and tables and layers and applications. This is actually a special resource that CloudFormation treats very differently. So all the way back at the top of this template file here, we have a line that says transform. And that transform line is read by CloudFormation. CloudFormation says, aha, this is a special type of template that I need to treat a little bit differently. I'm going to have to process this against this transform, which is essentially an extra capability inside of CloudFormation. And so what happens then down below here is underneath the serverless function definition is we have a bunch of the attributes about first my Lambda function. So these are these first properties that you see up above here. So we see that I have where the code lives in this directory, where the handler lives for this, the runtime in this case, which is node 12, the memory configuration, which previously we talked a little bit about how 128 megabyte is the default. We did that just for example purposes, but today you could configure this all the way up to 6 gigabytes. We see here a line that says policies, and this is actually using something called a policy template, which is another capability of SAM, which streamlines all of the IAM, that you would typically have to define inside of a CloudFormation template. Basically, these two lines expand out to about 30 or 40 lines of YAML or JSON, depending on what language you're using. So this makes it really easy for you to be able to tell your Lambda function, hey, you're going to actually reference our resource called bucket name, which we see up above here. And you're only going to be able to talk to or read or get data just from that. And so that's an important way for you to be able to restrict it. In this case, it's just a read policy, so you're only going to be able to get objects from this bucket. And then down below here for basically lines 27 through 37, we see the trigger being configured for this Lambda function. So in this case, we've named that trigger file upload. It's of type S3. And then we're telling it that look at this bucket, look for events that are called object created, and then we're looking for files that are .jpeg, or end in .jpeg, I should say, the suffix of that. So again, these 37 lines of code take care of all of this. And you could take this template file and you could use it to stamp out multiple environments, such as dev, staging, prod. You could use it to manage the resources and update them. Typically, much like you see here, you would have this file in some sort of code repository. So you're actually treating and version controlling your infrastructure, and again, being able to put it through a traditional developer lifecycle. So this definitely is more or less what we would consider to be the best practices of how you would build and define a serverless application using SAM. Now, there's a much more complicated example in the pre-signed URLs repo that James shared earlier before here. And if we come down here to the 2 template files, including this last one that says template with auth, you'll actually see this is 89 lines. And what this one gives you is an HTTP endpoint that has authorization configured. It has CORS headers configured, which CORS is always one of those things that trips people up. And then it has a number of, has another function, it has an S3 bucket, and then in this case, outputs, which gives me some information about the resources that I'm launching.
Actually, Chris, one thing I just had to mention on that is HTTP API is a relatively new flavor of API we've offered, but it's significantly easier now to add authorization to those APIs as well. So you can see with just a few lines at the top there, you can create your own authorizer that uses JOT tokens, and it makes it super easy to add really robust security to your backend application.
Yeah. Again, what you see basically right through here from lines 13 to 25 is configuring API Gateway for you. API Gateway is another one of the serverless products that we have here at AWS. It has a lot of the same benefits that Lambda and S3 have, in that it automatically scales for you. You don't need to think about really any sort of operational aspects, such as running infrastructure, patching infrastructure, dealing with servers or auto-scaling configuration. All of that gets handled for you by the service. And so it aligns really, really well in a serverless application, and is, again, part of this kind of common stack that we see with serverless APIs. So both of these SAM templates are in the 2 repositories that we've shared earlier. We'll make sure we get both of those links here pasted in here, as well as the link to more of the S3 resources that we have in regards to Lambda from today. You can find a whole lot of examples in the documentation for AWS SAM, as well as typically almost all of the samples that we will publish in blog posts and other talks will include a SAM template. So there's a lot of material out there that you can learn from. Okay. So, and actually I went out of order here. I was just actually showing you this template, which is the one that configures API Gateway and a Lambda function and a bucket from that application. So what did that template look like? It was the last one that I just showed you, which is in the second link. So that's all there for you.
So everything we're showing you here with SAM, you could also build in the console as well. There's nothing stopping you doing that. So if you feel comfortable building there, that's a good place to start. But we feel that as you start to develop these and want to build more complex applications, using a framework such as SAM can really help accelerate your development.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a big improvement on your life as a developer to use a tool like SAM. Now, we had mentioned that there are a number of other tools that exist out there. For example, the serverless framework is a great tool. It's very much well liked and used by serverless developers. There's another AWS tool called CDK, which is growing in popularity. And there's a number of other third parties out there, companies such as Stackery and Begin, that have really cool tools to help make your life managing these resources easier. I typically, and James probably does the same thing, we really just encourage you to think about how can you have a developer workflow that isn't just in the console clicking around, but is something that is potentially infrastructure as code managed, or using a real tool to manage your applications. It's going to give you a much better experience. So we mentioned and talked about the template side of this. The other side of it is the SAM CLI. Now, the CLI has a lot of capabilities, and we actually have a couple of different tech talks just about SAM CLI. It's way too much than we can possibly cover here today. But I do want to cover some of the key capabilities that you might want to look at. And again, this is an open source project. It's a command line tool you can go and install. It runs in Windows, Mac, Linux. pretty much anywhere. And again, a whole lot of capabilities as part of it. Now, if you're new to SAM, one of the first commands you'll want to check out is SAM init. SAM init allows you to initialize a new application. Essentially, it creates a repository or creates a directory structure for you that you can put into a repository, creates a bunch of sample code that follow a bunch of our best practices. And so this allows you to select what language you want to run. You can do things like select a dependency manager potentially. And so again, it's going to come out of the box with a lot of cool defaults that you can just pick up and learn from. So if you're really new to the serverless space, this is a great tool to just pick up, do the install of it, and then run SAM init, and right away you're off to the races with a bunch of cool example code. Now, in that example code, you will typically have, as we show here kind of in the right-hand side of the screen there, a README file, which will include instructions for what to do. Typically, at some point, it's going to tell you to run the command SAM build. Now, SAM build is probably the next key command inside of the CLI that you'll use really, really regularly. This is something that if you have a continuous integration or continuous delivery pipeline or tool, you would typically run SAM build as part of that process. And so what SAM build does, as the name might sound, is allow you to build the application artifact that you would deploy your serverless application with. So in the case of, say, a Python application or a Node.js application, you can have it automatically pull down all the dependencies and bundle them all together for you. And you can do this whether you were using the zip file format or, which we just recently announced at REAME 2020, a container image-based format. And so a bunch of different options there for you. As you can see here, there's a number of aspects, but basically this is going to take your code that's just raw text and make it into a artifact that then the Lambda service can run in response to events. How do you do that? Well, then the next command that you're going to use probably really regularly is SAM deploy. So SAM deploy, again, pretty straightforward name here, allows you to take that code and put it up to the AWS environment of your choice, or the AWS region, I should say, and then be able to run your application in the real services. And so this is actually going to call the CloudFormation service using the SAM template, which would then create or maybe update or modify the resources. So again, the idea here is that you use SAM ongoing for managing and building your applications and their architecture. And so SAM deploy becomes a really common, everyday command that you end up running. Cool, so that is SAM. I want to pause real quick. Are there any questions on SAM? Well, it's going twice. All right, so we'll get to the next part of it, which is after you've deployed your application, what are you going to do? So we've seen some examples here of code that James has already deployed and has up there and running. And thankfully, all of James's examples today went pretty smoothly. There weren't any issues. However, let's say that you had a problem, right? Things are going to go boom at some point. How do you go back and figure out what might have happened with them? And typically, it's not just when things break. You also, we've talked a number of times here today about performance issues, how you think about them, monitoring, tracing, logging, are all aspects that you want to think about. Is your application performing right for your business? Is it, are sales up or sales down? How might you think about that? So one term that's really commonly used in the industry is observability. And observability is not just the tooling that's involved, but it's a lot about the methodology and how you think about how your applications are performing for your business. Again, not just in the break fix world of things, but overall, are they meeting needs? Are customers happy? Are things performant? We have a lot of content out there at AWS about observability. So this is going to be kind of a brief run through of what some of the things are that you have available to you in a serverless application. Now, typically when we talk about observability, we talk about three kind of core technical aspects: metrics, logs, and traces. And so metrics are typically numeric data that you would capture from a application or from your infrastructure. You might be used to thinking about things like requests per second, latency, error numbers that might be occurring. In a more traditional sense, you might be thinking about stuff like CPU utilization. Now in Lambda, that all works a little bit differently. And thankfully with services like Lambda, CloudWatch is actually, which I'll talk about here in a moment, metrics capture is built directly into it. Similarly, logging, so this is typically text-based information that you capture, again, either from your code or from the infrastructure or from the service itself. And this could contain anything from troubleshooting information to business-related information to, again, things like stack traces and error code. And then lastly, we have here traces, which is kind of the third concept. And so traces typically something you would see like in an application performance troubleshooting tool. But in what we're going to show you here today, this is how you would think about how various services connect. So in a couple of examples that James has had so far already here today, we've had API Gateway talking to Lambda, talking to S3, or talking to DynamoDB. How do I know that all of those components are flowing and working properly? So the first two of these are handled by a service here at AWS called Amazon CloudWatch. CloudWatch, again, is built into almost all the services that we have here at AWS. There's almost every service emits some sort of default metric or log, depending on what the service is, what the needs might be. And then on the second side of this, we have AWS X-Ray. And so AWS X-Ray is a tracing tool which has a number of capabilities for it. So X-Ray might be something that you haven't seen or haven't played with before. Again, what is it used for? So profiling, troubleshooting your applications. There's a really awesome diagram here from actually a recent tech talk we just gave earlier this week on X-Ray and AWS step functions, another part of the serverless stack. And so what we see here in this nice little diagram is a flow of an application. And so in this application, I am using step functions to do multiple things, to talk to Lambda, to talk to Dynamo, to talk to SNS. And Amazon S3 has X-Ray support as well. So when you are talking to S3, you can capture data to it from Lambda. When S3 is invoking a Lambda function, you can get information about it. So you kind of get things in both directions. Now with X-Ray, there are three key components. There's the service map, the trace view map, and the trace timeline. And they each give you different bits of information. And I'll show everyone this here in a moment. So let's talk about the service map. So the service map, which we just saw here, kind of gives me an idea of what's going on in my application, what components are talking to what components here. Now, the different highlighted colors represent things from, say, latencies or failure or warning states. So I could see here that something wasn't quite right, and I can visually identify that based on the yellow in the circle. And now, again, this actually represents work that was done in a step functions execution. So in this step functions here, we see that I'm going to capture some input. I'm going to see if this was from an object being put into S3 or being deleted. If it was put, then maybe I want to, in this case, pull text out of it, look at some language information, and take on a bunch of things there. I just saw Robert join us. Robert, do you have a question?
I do not have a question. However, I think we need to start wrapping up this section. So
okay. All right. Sorry. So I'm going to jump through and actually just get to the good part, which is in the console here. So 1 second before we go, and apologies. So all of this stuff that I was just talking about and a lot more you could find here in the console. So if you come to the console and you go to CloudWatch and click on Service Map, this is where you would find information about how your applications are performing. And now the account that I'm in, I have a whole bunch of stuff that's going on. And I can come in here and I can filter based on certain services. So for example, I can look at all of the information and all of the requests that are coming to S3. Let me expand this down here. So I can look over a certain period of time and in my account see what is happening with data that I have in S3. Troubleshoot a bunch of information, go into the traces, which is the individual information about the requests that are happening from this. And now these are starting to load down below here. Oops, and I see my average performance. And then find out more about what it is that happened inside of this. So I can see what bucket this was from. This was from a canary that I have running on another application. I can see the information about the average request latency of writing to that bucket, as well as if there were any errors or issues or anything like that. So apologies for going into, I guess, too much detail here for the time that we had and trying to keep things moving along with this. But that is a very quick run through.